Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We have two speakers for our next session, and our next session is related to one of the questions we got from Max. What's the role of the industry? And it's always nice to have two representatives of the industry. And I prepared a number of questions. I even just sent an email to Giulia. But more important is we would like to give them the possibility to start by giving their presentation and their view on the topic of this week. So Giulia, am I allowed to invite you to ask you the question to start? Because the other one is coming from the Netherlands and he's a man and he will talk for hours. So I prefer to ask you to give it a start. And
no problem, with pleasure.
Okay.
Even though, yeah, it's always funny to go first just because I'm a woman, but I'll accept this time.
No, it's just that men try to be polite, so that's the only thing.
So I did prepare a couple of slides, but I think given the format and what I've heard about previous sessions, maybe it's better if we keep it as an informal conversation. I can share slides later if you want, but they don't really tell you much. So I prefer that we all sort of discuss together. So when I was asked to consider this question, I wanted to start from the beginning by saying that the industry, the tech industry, of which I'm part.
Am I allowed to ask you one question before you start?
Yeah.
You're representing the industry, but what does that mean?
All right. Yeah, I should probably introduce myself.
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
Please do.
So I represent the industry in two ways. When I was invited for the first version of this panel, I was working for HP, so for a big multinational tech company. Hardware company, so we'll second that already makes a difference, but that was my role. And I was, what is, I guess, interesting for the purpose of this panel that also looks at governance is that in my 5 years at HP, I had a number of roles always in the government affairs department, be it at national level, European level, or global level. So my task, as you might be aware, was to be in between, as it were, industry and government, be it the European institutions or globally. So really trying to understand how the interaction between these two worlds, the public sector and the private sector, evolved. And that's where a lot of my remarks today come from seeing how this evolved. Right now, I changed job, but I work for a variety of industries in the sense that I went to a consultancy and I'm leading the tech practice. So that means that we have clients across the tech sector more broadly, be it software, platforms, hardware, telcos, et cetera, and even clients who are not necessarily tech per se, but can nowadays considered as tech because everything is tech. So I've gone from seeing sort of vertically deeply inside one company to seeing lots of companies and seeing how they interact with the European institutions. I'm based out of Brussels, so that's a little bit my background. So does that answer your question, Henk?
Yes, that's answering the question.
Excellent.
Because it's also, when we are going to our discussions later, you also understand governance. You have an idea what the private sector and the public sector have in common.
Yes, I spent many years studying government. I have a PhD in political science, looking at governments precisely in a comparative manner across Europe. So I've always been fascinated because I find that I'm a lobbyist, I do government affairs, and government affairs really changes depending on which country you do it in. So there's almost like a cultural adaptation of my role, whether I'm lobbying the Swedish government or the Italian government or the EU institutions. So it's really interesting. I'll try and generalize, of course, but I think we should keep in mind that the role of industry vis-a-vis public policy and governments in general changes a lot depending on the culture.
Okay.
So we can go in some anecdotes if you want to later, which is fun.
Oh, first you're allowed to give your presentation.
Thank you very much.
I went too fast. Sorry for that.
No worries, no worries. I always like talking about how being a lobbyist is a tough job. So the quick observation on precisely this role, this interaction between government and the private sector, is that up until, I guess, roughly the Snowden scandal and WikiLeaks, etc., the tech industry was really considered the cool child in the game. We were allowed to do almost anything we wanted. There was a really positive attitude to globalization, to the idea that the tech world was a global one where everyone would connect, etc. So there was an upward trend of, you as a tech industry, you're almost allowed to do anything you want because you're going to bring positive, I guess, positive developments to society. But then we entered into a phase that has been aptly called by the economist the techlash phase. So the techlash comes in two ways. I think there's a public opinion revolt almost against the disruption. You know, disruption used to be cool, and now disruption is worrying. Disruption is what prevents people from finding jobs, or maybe makes them lose jobs. Disruption also is worrying for the society as a whole, disinformation, misinformation. So I think we really went from, we trust the tech sector is great, to we don't really know what they're doing, and we kind of don't understand how they're using our data and all sorts of things. So on the public opinion front, that was the first reaction. Combined with that, you had the state. And what I mean by the state, I mean by the change of perspective that went from globalization, the Washington Consensus, you know, open borders, trade, international trade, etc., is all good and positive, to the rise, which we see at this moment in time, of nationalism, protectionism, trade wars, etc. So if you put these two trends combined, it's clear that the tech industry is in between a rock and a hard place. So on the one hand, it has the public being increasingly skeptical, and on the other hand, it has the state wanting to take back control, almost wanting to prevent the tech industry from getting out of the way. And this is why we keep hearing about digital sovereignty, about strategic autonomy, about all of these concepts that are subsuming the tech sector under the competences of the national government, which wasn't really the case before. So I may be a bit pessimistic, and I know that some people might disagree with this analysis of the evolution, but I really see the current time and the current period as one where governments are striking back and are really trying to get back to control over the tech industry. Concretely, what does that mean? I think it means two trends. One is increased liability for the tech industry. What does liability mean? Maybe it's a bit of a legal jargon, technical term, but concretely it means that, you know, you've all heard of the responsibilities of platforms being increasingly considered. We can go in, you know, in the details of the Digital Services Act, and, you know, on both sides of the Atlantic, we see platforms being asked to take more responsibility for content. We also see hardware manufacturers being asked to take more responsibility for instance, repairing and all of the kind of environmental aspects. And we also see liability in terms of legal responsibility for damages caused by cybersecurity incidents, by AI, working or not working. So overall, the trend is really, you industry, you've had it all, you were free to do whatever you wanted up until now. Now it's the time to really take your responsibilities. The second trend that industry should expect is precisely the fragmentation or balkanization of the IT stack. What do I mean? I mean that while back in the days, a company like HP would do one product and be able to sell it everywhere. Now, especially with the rise of China and their, rush to become autonomous and to have its own IT stack, but we also see the same in Russia as well as in other places. Companies should start thinking that they might have to have different models or different IT stacks depending on the trade block where they want to trade, where they want to sell the products in. And it's the same for, cloud and, the European cloud. And then you see cybersecurity requirements being used as non-tariff barriers to prevent to prevent companies from selling in a certain market. So, so the industry, as well as having to take on more responsibilities, will also have to face the fact that it's not a global industry anymore, and it can't be, because states are increasingly demanding local products, demanding, I don't know, not standard international encryption, but rather specific ones, etc., etc. So I can give you some examples later if you want to go into the details. So industry is in a difficult position, in a position where I think it's good that it's being confronted with its own responsibilities, but it's also really a paradigm shift, going from a lot of self-regulation to expecting hard regulation on AI, on cybersecurity certification, on platform responsibilities, and so on and so forth. Last remark, because I know that I only have 10 minutes. I think industry is in a particularly difficult place in Europe. Why is that? Because industry in the States or industry in China, they at least can simply decide to side either with the US, so the blue IT stack, or the red IT stack. European industries don't really have that option because they don't have the full IT stack. I mean, one could argue that China doesn't yet, but they're getting there. So European industries are really stuck in the middle, where they're in the middle, so kind of in the middle of the tech Cold War, without really having a third option. The European Commission is, of course, trying to create that third option by pushing for digital sovereignty, as I said, the European cloud and whatnot, investments in AI, but we're not yet there. So it's particularly hard for companies in Europe to really navigate this this global tech geopolitics, which is becoming increasingly complicated. So I'll stop here because I only had 10 minutes, but Henk, I'm happy to answer any question.
I'm sure that there are many questions, and I'm hesitating because I immediately want to jump in, but that's not my role now. So thanks for giving it a start. I will now switch to your colleague, Richard, and ask him to kick off his view on the role of industry. So Richard, happy you're there, happy you're healthy. I have no clue what the sheeps are doing behind you, but
just hanging out, Henk.
Take the floor.
Okay. I'm not sure if this is going to turn out to be a really good thing or a really difficult thing, but I'm going to be taking an approach that's very different from what Giulia has presented. So this will mean that we either have a great diversity of opinion, or we won't be able to have a conversation because we're talking about two different frameworks. I'll do a really quick introduction, although I think most of you have already heard that. I am currently the president of a systems integrator headquartered in Milano, although I am currently sitting in London right now. When I was invited, as with Giulia, I was in a different role. So when I was invited to participate in the discussions this week, I was the Chief Technology Officer for the government industry for Huawei in Europe. And I was one of the spokespeople for Huawei in Europe. And if you've read any headlines in the last couple of months, you could imagine that perhaps that's a difficult role to have for a Chinese company right now. That was not the reason, however, that I decided to take a different career move. The reason for that, which I think might be relevant in the course of discussions today, is because my real entry into this space started in 2003 when I moved into a public sector role. And I moved into a public sector role because I was working for an IT company that was working on a $40 million project for one of the governments in Canada. And as we were working on that project, we started to get the sense that things were not going to turn out particularly well. So we brought our concerns to the government, to our customer, and suggested that they might need to intervene. They declined to do so. And I was very lucky that I worked for a company who was willing to take a principled stance. And so we withdrew from the consortium and said, if you want to go ahead with this project, you have to do it without us because we don't believe it's going to be a success. So when that $40 million project ended up costing $382 million with no return on investment, the ministers came back and suggested that maybe I could be part of the solution and part of the recovery effort. And so my love is the public sector, and my love is being a civil servant. However, I have extremely low pain thresholds. And after a few years of working in the public sector, I realized that I was going to be more successful if I worked in the private sector. I don't have any of the academic qualifications of any of the people who are on this phone call today. So what I can do is simply share an observation based on the fact that I have worked in both public and private sector, and the fact that in the last 7 years, I've spent 2 years living in Africa, I've spent 2 years living in the United States, I spent a year in Germany, a year at home in the Netherlands, and now a year in the UK. And so I've had the fortune of being able to see things from a slightly different perspective, perhaps. Although I know Ilona was talking earlier about her great travels as well, so perhaps it's not so unique in this context. The approach that I decided to take was simply share with you a couple of my observations on the topic of governance in the public sector, and then give you the opportunity to ask some questions after that. Again, I'm a little bit ashamed to admit that this is going to be very simplistic, but I am a Dutch farmer. Simple is the only thing that I do well. So what I will do is I will put some slides up. There are only 3 of them, which means in theory I should be able to hold to my 10 minutes, but Hank, feel free to mute me if it gets a bit wordy. You can see the slides now, correct?
It's fine, Richard.
Okay, super. A couple of observations that I like to share, because I think if we don't understand why it's important, we can't bring the right degree of focus to the conversation. When we talk about governance, there's a couple of things that I like to refer to as being of vital importance to the discussion. In Europe, right now, in 2020, 21% of Europeans live below the poverty line. And if we look at Italy, where many of us are sitting, or where I will be sitting very soon, we have to consider the fact that in January of 2020, i.e. before the coronavirus hit, 36% of Italian households did not have the wherewithal to handle an unexpected expense of just 800 euros. If we look at healthcare, we know, of course, the impact of the coronavirus and the COVID-19. We also need to keep in mind things such as the fact that 80% of Europeans over the age of 60 have 2 or more chronic conditions. And we should also bear in mind that 40% of Europeans are now approaching 60 years of age or greater. If we look at food and water, I'll use the region of Campania in Italy as an example, where more than 70% of treated fresh water is lost between the treatment facilities and the taps at which they're supposed to arrive. We also know that across Europe, about 1/3 of all Europeans are now suffering from some form of water stress. If we look at equality and inclusion, in 2020, we still have a double X tax of 14.8%, meaning if you were born with 2 X chromosomes instead of an XY chromosome, your paycheck at the end of every month is 14.8% lower than that of somebody who has XY chromosomes. Fortunately, in Italy, it's a little bit better. It's only a 5% tax, but in 2020, that still strikes me as being a little bit shameful. We also know that 46% of single parent households in Europe experience social inclusion. We know that 53% of people who have a physical disability cannot get a job. And if they have 2 physical disabilities, that number rises to 90%. If we think about clean energy, I always find it very disturbing that we are increasingly importing our energy from outside of the continent. That importation is growing from 50% to 70%. And although we make an awful lot of noise about renewable energies, our consumption of fossil fuels continues to increase 4% year over year and is predicted to do so at least until 2035. If we think about work, we know right now 45 million people are on furlough as a result of coronavirus. And across Europe, we have an unemployment rate of about 10%. And if we think about education, in the last 6 months, 75 million students in Europe have had their education disrupted. If we talk about Italy in particular, we know that of 79 countries that were tested, Italy finished in the bottom half. And in a particularly disturbing statistic, 5% of Italians aged 15 could differentiate between fact and opinion in newspaper articles. And if we think about how much garbage is being published on the internet these days, this inability to discern truth from opinion is quite disturbing. What I've also noticed in the last couple of years, and I've seen examples of this again this week, is that we need to make sure when we talk about governance, when we talk about data, when we talk about IT, that we are very, very precise in our language. Because if we're not precise in our language, if we're not clear on the questions that we're answering, we have no guarantee that the answers we come up with are actually going to be relevant, meaningful, and useless. And I'm not going to give you the answers to any of these things because it's not my place to do so, and you're all smart enough to figure it out for yourself, but I'll give you a couple of examples of very common errors. We don't, as a rule, have a very good understanding of the difference between data and knowledge, information, and intelligence. And if we don't understand those concepts particularly well, we're in really deep trouble. And more importantly, if we don't understand the relationships or the transition points between those concepts, we're in really big trouble. And I'll give just one example. Information becomes knowledge through experience. Right? That's how we take a piece of knowledge or a piece of information and transfer that into knowledge. As we move into a world where our experiences are increasingly shaped by faceless algorithms developed by people who are probably faceless themselves in rooms far away from us, what we're seeing is that what we know is going to be fundamentally shaped by these algorithms. And quite frankly, I find that a terrifying prospect. So making sure that we really understand and have clarity in terminology is important. Another example is that I hear people very frequently confuse and conflate terms like invention and innovation and creativity. And again, if we're not clear on what we're talking about, we can't possibly hope to come up with answers. We see that again if we look at concepts such as strategic, tactical, and operational. And we see that again when we talk about the word governance. I'm going to make one observation based on the experiences that I've had over the last 20 years, and hopefully it won't be too controversial. But governance must be defined as being a balance of leadership and controllership. And if we don't define it that way, we're going to have some really big problems. Generally speaking, government is very, very good at controllership and very, very poor at leadership. In the private sector, we tend to be very good at leadership, but not so good at controllership. But leadership establishes direction, while controllership establishes focus. Leadership maximizes potential, but controllership results in sustainable action. Leadership inspires innovation, controllership establishes delivery. Leadership drives effectiveness, controllership drives efficiency. And there are countless examples that you'll be able to find of what happens if you favor leadership over controllership or vice versa. And we need to be very clear that this is an important concept we have to address when we're talking about governance. And so to bring this to a really quick close, I'll just share 3 of the tips that I learned from when I was in government. And I was trying to figure out how we needed to recover from a $382 million project failure. It's really simple. Number 1, if there's not one person in charge, then no one is in charge. There's a reason why, as a global government leader in companies like IBM and Huawei, I never did business in the Netherlands. It's because the Dutch government and our political system does not believe in individual decision making. It believes in decisions by consensus, and that leads to an awful lot of problems and a scenario in which I don't feel comfortable working. Decisions can be confirmed by groups, recommendations can be confirmed by committees, but decisions should be made by one person. When we talk about governance, another thing that I talk about is the fact that we should always try to focus on making every decision that absolutely must be made, and only the decisions that absolutely must be made. I see countless examples in the public sector where organizations or people are taking decisions that they don't need to take yet. And the reality is then by the time that decision needs to be implemented, the context, the situation has changed, and there's no longer a direct relationship between the decision and the resulting actions. And finally, what I think we really need to look at is making sure that we embed both leadership and controllership in organizations and in processes. And an example of that is procurement. In most government organizations, they see procurement as being purely a controllership function. And that means you end up with very low innovation, very low imagination solutions where the lowest viable proposal tends to win. And actually procurement can be one of the greatest enablers for change in a government if it's modified to take on a leadership and an innovation and an invention responsibility as well. But at the same time, when we have to make decisions, I often ask my customers to really try and separate whether a decision has a leadership component or a controllership component. And it's not always easy to bifurcate into just A or B, as I said. I believe that the answers are usually A plus B plus C plus D. But it's an interesting intellectual exercise to see how things would be different if we thought of them from a leadership perspective versus a controllership perspective. That's all that I wanted to share with you, simply a view from the private sector as to how governance happens right now in the public sector, some of the issues with that, and some ideas as to how we could potentially think about changing that. So Henk, I give it back to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm looking at all the questions and remarks which are posted now. So from that perspective, we did a wonderful job because everybody's awake and everybody is acting. What I would like to do before jumping into the discussion is asking Giulia to react on all the, not on all the statements of Richard, because it was quite philosophic what he was doing. But Giulia, what's your first reaction listening to Richard?
My reaction is that maybe we didn't necessarily have the same experience of the public sector. I never worked for the public sector, so maybe I've never seen it from the inside. Certainly interacting with the public sector, I do find that they're not necessarily as efficient as we would hope that they would be. And especially, I think nowadays they're increasingly in a reactive mode. So they mistook representation for being reacted to whatever the public thinks. But as I was saying at the beginning, generalizing is very, very difficult because each government, when they interact with the private sector, has a different attitude. And I'll be a little bit more specific. I think in some countries, the interaction with the private sector is more institutionalized in the sense that the private sector is consulted beforehand, before coming up with a policy proposal in a very transparent manner, etc. So in that sense, I think the distinction between leadership and controllership kind of blurs when decisions on policy making are taken jointly between government and industry. And that's something that I've seen, for instance, when I was based out of London. I had the impression that the UK government is very good at sort of bringing together those two aspects and ensuring, yes, of course, the government ultimately has the last word, but it's a very consensual decision-making process. On the contrary, in other countries like Italy, I see a lot more your model being applicable. So my reaction would be partially yes, but it depends. It depends on on the model of interaction between the private sector and the public sector, and also back to some of the points that were made in the chat to my presentation. I think they're also applicable to Richard's presentation. The idea that that companies might be good at leadership and not controllership. It also depends on the size of the company. It depends on the history of the company. So I don't want to be relativistic in my remarks, but I certainly think that there's probably a mix of both aspects in a lot of companies and in a lot of governments. So
yeah, okay. Of course, Richard, you have the last word for this first round. Because you can react on what Giulia was saying and also her presentation. So, Richard, what's your first reaction?
I think it's important in the first case for me to simply be really clear on the perspective I come from and the perspective I represent, which is that of local and regional government rather than national or international government. The first part of my public sector career was regional. My current public sector career is very local. Most of the work that I do is with cities or regional governments. There was a middle piece that was focused primarily on national and international agencies, and I would perhaps have a different perspective. But right now, when we talk about it from the perspective of local government, I think it's important to understand, particularly around technology, that most national governments, and I would put Spain, Estonia, some of the Scandinavian countries as exceptions, but most European national governments have abrogated responsibility for technology decisions, and they've really refused to take a key role. And so my clients, the cities and the regions, feel quite alone and quite ill-equipped to deal with a lot of the decisions that they have to make. The Netherlands and Germany are two perfect examples. The Netherlands came up with the smart city strategy a year and a half ago. Well, I mean, the smart city domain has been around for 20 some odd years. Germany is even later than that. Italy is struggling to come up with that right now. So I think a lot of the conversation up until now has been in this group has been at a national or multinational or international level. I should be really clear that what I'm representing is a much lower level view. The other thing that I just want to be really clear on, I have not proposed any definitions on the term governance. The only thing that I did is suggest that when we talk about governance, one of the paradigms that we need to consider is that there needs to be a balance of leadership and controllership inside that.
Thank you very much for this first round. I give the audience a task, a role, and I start with asking Peter why he was upset by the definition of governance coming from Richard. So, Peter, welcome again, and can you explain your remark?
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it was just a bit of a stunner when I saw your definition of governance, which seemed to be a bit partial, to say the least. Now you've qualified it, but the bluntness of the slide got me going. So if you're watching the chat, that even this early in English morning, I'm an hour earlier than you guys, got me. Whoops! Who said that? Yeah, I mean, it's a very particularist view that we're seeing. Okay, I can see it has merit in the context in which it's set. But I have worked in the field of government and governance in relation to civic society or civil society for 20 years, and I thought, oh, hang on, I'm missing here somewhere. That's what got me going for the thing. We had an interesting bit of chat. It's very difficult, I think, to get into this now, because I realise now that this is the sort of there's a debate here about the kind of, what do they call it now? They call it the kind of caring company stuff. What's that acronym for? Inclusive, environmental, which now big companies are selling to commercial companies. You know, be environmentally sustainable, worry about inclusiveness. And it's a lot of money has been, my granddaughter works in it, a lot of money. So there's all that. There's a new public management thing, which we could have an hour discussion on, of how the hell we got here. with new public management in different countries in Europe, and what a sideshow that turned out to be in the United Kingdom, God help us. So that's what triggered my input to this. So I find it a bit hard to grapple with what I've just heard until it's actually fixed in terms of what its core message is, which I think I may have profoundly, because I reacted, misunderstood.
Don't be too polite, Peter.
Can I ask a question to
Yes,
Richard?
of course.
Because the idea of leadership and controllership, they're obviously applicable to sort of internal decision making, but to Peter's point, my impression from also what I said in the presentation is that nowadays vis-a-vis the external world, be it civil society, be it the public, the consumers, whatever, the main asset the companies are trying desperately to get is some kind of, I call it trust, but it could be called something else. So trust as an asset, precisely because of the techlash, precisely because of all the evolutions that I've explained. So I was wondering, in your model, sorry if I call it your model because it's probably not your model, but in your vision of governance, where does the, it's not even accountability in this, it can also be accountability, but where does the interaction with the external world come in finding that balance between controllership and leadership? And what about, the outside?
So if we want to have an hour-long discussion on governance models, we could do that. It's a very different approach that I've taken over the last 20 years when I give a lecture on how to do public sector governance. The governance framework, the governance model that I take to the public sector is far more complicated than I can talk about right now. At its heart, one of the principles that it tries to achieve is a balance between controllership and leadership. So again, that's not the definition of governance. That's simply one of the principles that we have to consider when we talk about governance. The role of the the role of the private sector in this, I think, has to be one of, it has to be an advisory role. And maybe the easiest way that I can illustrate this is to just give a really quick example. One of the cities that we've worked with in the last couple of years is the city of Gelsenkirchen in Germany. It was a city that I picked very deliberately because it is the poorest city in Germany. The average household income is 16,274 euros per year. I will repeat, 16,274 euros per year. And the question was, how can we deliver smart city technologies? How could we do a technology project that would start to address some of the characteristics of that city? And how could we do that in an economically viable fashion? The city of Gelsenkirchen is not particularly large, 150,000 people. They have a chief data officer, they have a chief technology officer, but they are not, from an IT perspective, a particularly sophisticated organization. As a service provider who is trying to achieve that caring advisor role, who's talking about environmental, economic, and social sustainability and responsibility, one of the things that we did was to start by creating a data lake into which we created a policy framework that required every IT company that wanted to deliver services in the city of Gelsenkirchen to store their data in that data lake. And then we forced the city to take the classes necessary to develop data scientists, to develop a data management capability, to understand API brokering, so that they could start to control the way in which data was being generated and consumed within their city. Because we could not take that role on. We felt it was vitally important that the city of Gelsenkirchen and the cities of Gelsenkirchen had control over their own data, but we felt it was a role that the government needed to take on. And so we pushed, cajoled, and bullied them into taking on those responsibilities, to building the skill sets necessary to do that, and have enabled the city of Gelsenkirchen now to assume the role of control in the IT relationships that they have with their service providers in the city. So from a governance perspective, what we saw our role in this particular scenario with this particular client was to help them understand why something was important, and then to push them to develop the capabilities while at the same time giving them the tools that allowed them to execute that capability. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I mean, it occupied 3 or 4 minutes, so hopefully it sounded intelligent.
Roland, you were raising hands, so I give the floor to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks to both of you for really great presentations. I just have a quick question, maybe for both, but it's maybe aimed at Richard. Like we spoke a lot about governments and how they work, and I'm just wondering what your view is on undemocratic governments, because they seem to be playing a bigger role now in technology policy, in AI policy, and even in Europe, we have governments that are drifting towards undemocratic regimes. And I'm just wondering what your view is of how those governments make decisions and what impact that has for European policy, and also maybe to Giulia as well. That would be a question. So thanks.
Okay. Giulia, if it's okay, I'll take this one first, and then I'll give it to you too, because I think you'll have perhaps a slightly different answer.
Yeah.
My observation, quite simply, is that if we don't have citizen representation, nothing that we will do is correct. I lived in the city of Toronto for 15 years. I lived just outside of Cabbagetown. Cabbagetown is famously the home of Jane Jacobs, one of the most well-regarded urbanologists in the world. And a lot of my view on urban living was shaped by Jane Jacobs. And she said quite famously that a city can be successful and only be successful when it's designed by and for the people. If we talk about a democratic framework for government, it is, and I'm not the first person to say it, the least worst option. Because I have loads and loads of neighbors. I've had loads of neighbors when I lived in Munich. I had loads of neighbors when I lived in Nairobi, in Washington, D.C., and now as I live in the city of London. And quite frankly, I would not trust very many of them to make decisions on my behalf. However, the alternatives are all considerably worse. I think it's part of the role of the private sector in partnership with the public sector to do the greatest job possible in helping the citizens to understand the implications of technology decisions, while at the same time recognizing we're never going to get informed decisions from the citizenry, because in a lot of ways and for a variety of reasons, they just don't care. Right? If you look at 64 billion euros of personal wealth being added to Jeff Bezos in the last 9 months, right? Everybody knows that ordering from Amazon is not good for their local economy, and they don't really care about it because it's convenient and it's easy to order from Amazon, particularly during a pandemic. I think we have to accept that there are good things and bad things, but I'll give one, I'll finish with one really quick example. In the city of Duisburg, also in Germany, we ran 7 workshops in the second half of 2018, and we worked with public and private sector partners, and we invited members of the public to share their wants and needs for Duisburg as a smart city. And we came up with a list of 147 different features and functions or services that would be considered ideal, none of which were practical, none of which were going to achieve the financial, the economic, the social, the political objectives of the broader community. It was really important to know this so that we could understand what the citizens and the residents were thinking about. But as an elected body, it's also the responsibility of the government to make the decisions about what the citizens need, not necessarily what they ask for. And I think that's a really big part of governance as well, is being able to differentiate between those and try to keep people happy by giving them what they need, even if it might not be what they wanted. Giulia, thank you.
Giulia, you also have neighbors?
No, I was going to say I'll take a slightly different view and maybe more in line with the global approach that I shared at the beginning. I'll start by the simple observation that non-democratic governments are probably better at technology. Now, take it in, just give me 1 second, than non-democratic governments. What do I mean? Let's take China as the best example. We all know Made in China 2025. We know the social credit system. We know all of the ways in which not only they're using technology, but they're pushing and they're catching up on the technological front. And I think such push also in ways that we would not necessarily agree with, but they certainly are good at it, and they're achieving what they want. They're managing to pool data. Now we have all this data strategy at European level, etc. China is already doing it very easily. They can put money, they can put subsidies, they can put barriers, etc. So I think the first observation is that in terms of the pure technological side of things, I wouldn't say that non-democratic governments are less efficient or less capable. The second observation, that goes back to what I was saying, is that each country's use or deployment of technology simply reflects whatever political culture they have. So we know the debate on facial recognition and all the rest of it. Where I think it's interesting is the European idea that they can still export their norms and export the model of European technology or technological governance, talking about governance, to other countries, which I see it as increasingly difficult. Take Russia as another example. They just mandated that for public sector, they need to have local technologies or be penalized if it's international technology. So those undemocratic countries have means that democratic countries don't necessarily have. Does it mean that the European way, the ethical AI technology, whatever, it's weaker? No, not necessarily, but it's just a different model, and also the way at which say the European Union comes to hard regulation versus soft regulation, etc., also reflects that taking on board of stakeholders, which takes time, which makes compromises. So my response would be, to your question, to the last part of your question, you were talking about Hungary and Poland, I guess, in particular, when you mentioned European states that are drifting towards undemocratic means. There's no difference there between technology and non-technology, in the sense that if the European Union is not able to keep them in check on fundamental rights, etc., there's no way that the European Union is going to keep in check their use of technology. So my underlying point is that technology is just a means, and it goes back to what I was saying. The state, ultimately the government, is the one in charge, deciding what governance to give to its deployment of technology. So yeah, a bit pessimistic, but that's how I see it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Ronan, it's up to you to react, because you got your answers. What can you do with it?
Well, maybe the follow-up question, and maybe it's too big a question for now, but the idea of Europe using technologies from countries that are not democratic and technologies that are developed there. Now I know there's a big, you could say that the US government is using it in a kind of a strategic way, but I'm just wondering, even for European policy, in terms of using technologies developed in countries that are not democratic. How does that fit into our AI strategy for the next 10 years? Because we are relying on a lot of technologies, even in the Netherlands, for facial recognition on technologies that are not developed in Europe. And I'm just wondering how you see that's going to shape European policy over the next 10 years.
Wow.
Shall I try
Wow.
a very short answer? What I see as a reaction from Europe is increasingly creating market access regulation that would a little bit take the environmental field as a parallel. Putting certain requirements and criteria, be it the energy labeling, be it whatever, so that whatever comes in the European market has certain standards. I see a similar trend in the tech sector. What do I mean? I mean, with the Cybersecurity Act, IT services and devices, etc., that will be in the European market will have to abide to a certain level of cybersecurity certification. Now it's voluntary, but I expect it to be mandatory. If there's going to be this AI labeling, if they go for one of the options that they have now in the inception impact assessment, that will be again a requirement. So I think the way Europe is tackling this problem, which you rightly raised, is by leveraging or using its commercial strength to impose certain high standards on both the ethical AI front, the cybersecurity front, and we could continue to mention other ones. Whether this is successful, whether this is really efficient, we don't know. In the environmental space, often it's debatable whether that has achieved anything at all, because in other countries they continue to do unenvironmentally friendly things and we keep buying their products. But I think that's the only way I see this being managed at the European level right now.
Yeah, if I could just add then a little bit on top of that, in conjunction with Giulia was saying, I think the problem that we're experiencing right now is that from a technology perspective, we don't have an awful lot of alternatives. I think what we see is over recent history, we see a constant back and forth of a pendulum between tightly coupled, loosely coupled, between international and global and local, and everything's going back and forth. And I think to the extent that we have a very open, fair and transparent global economy, we will see that reflected in IT. And then it's very easy to use services or solutions or software or hardware, thinking as they came from Huawei, without an awful lot of concern. But to the extent that international geopolitics become increasingly fractured, we will see that reflected in our IT infrastructure. Our problem, as was mentioned right at the outset of this discussion, is right now we don't have the options because we allowed ourselves as a continent, we allowed ourselves to get cut out a little bit, right? And the focus shifted east and west. So what we need to do is make sure that we've got enough capabilities, that we've got the right framework economically, politically, socially, to make sure that we can accommodate those back and forth swings, east to west, global, local, tightly coupled, loosely coupled, everything.
I like to skip to Chiara because she was raising a question. Chiara, can you put your question or your statement on the table?
Yes, of course. Actually, was as I wrote, it's more a philosophical consideration than a real question. It's about democracy. That is, of course, not.
But to be honest, Chiara, the whole discussion is quite philosophical. I thought that we could have a very technical discussion, which I prepared, but it went completely different than expected, at least for me. So I was happy with your remark too. So feel free.
Yes. It's. I mean, I come from political studies myself, yes. So I do read about the value of democracy, and actually, I could say that even if it's very complicated life in democracy, because you need to negotiate and to mediate every time with people, with people that you completely disagree with, and so it's very tiring. Actually, it's the only condition that allow disagreement, and so it's very dangerous to take the shortcut. And in some occasions, I think that especially private companies, because this is their business, try to find the shorter way to achieve their goals. I mean, it's not a fault; it's just part of the game. But in a complex world such as our own world, which is so interconnected, this may have very disruptive, in a negative sense, effect. And
I think, Chiara, if I could just add on to that, I think where we are right now, and the problem that we've got is this tension that was suddenly created by capitalism really asserting a role as a form of government, right? democracy and capitalism now seem to be at odds with each other, or at least the current form of capitalism. And that highlights a lot of the weaknesses inside a democratic form of government. And I think to a large degree, that's partly where we need to focus. Again, very philosophical and meta conversation. But we cannot ignore the fact that big tech is capitalist and extremely capitalist, right? And brought us to that point where it simply it beggars belief that we now see a company like Apple that is worth more than the entire FTSE in the UK, right? That a single company has got a value that is greater than 5 of the top 10 economies combined. That's really where the current problem comes from, I think.
Giulia, of course you can answer it as a consultant, but from an HP perspective, were you taking the shortcuts?
This is being recorded. So, no, I mean, HP aside, I think what Chiara mentioned, the shortcut, doesn't really work in the sense that there is no such thing as shortcut in democracies, and where it's not democracies, the shortcuts backfire. So, because you don't have a safe and predictable business environment, because the state can from one day to the next exclude you from the market. So I wouldn't say that shortcuts for industry is necessarily the best way forward, because sooner or later, this will lead to, as I said, a backlash or a backfire. I did my PhD thesis on technocratic governments, so precisely when governments go the technical way instead of going the democratic way. So I am aware of the allure of some of those solutions, but by no means what I said before was a recommendation of adopting those solutions for the governance of our technological world or tech future. I was simply saying that we need to ensure, and this is maybe the experience of a lobbyist, but certainly that industry is consulted and taken into consideration, etc., especially as governments are trying to regulate it more and more after a period that, as I described, was a little bit more carefree and a little bit more, data flows everywhere. Well, now you have data localization laws, hardware is global, now you have specific national hardware requirements, and so on and so forth. So I think industry is, can and should help understanding how this new paradigm should look like.
Alberto, you had the feeling that put your question by yourself or your statement.
Well, probably I am kind of, I don't know how to phrase this. In a way, I support the idea of democracy, and maybe connected with what Richard and Giulia just said. I'm not sure if maybe the position of Google comes from a different understanding of how people should be involved, and I mean users, should be involved in their growth. And that is probably another type of democracy, probably counting on different sets of people, different sets of collaborators, that can be integrated into the growth or the strategy of whether it's a company or a government or an international organization, in order to learn what really matters. And then from there, spur their growth, if it is growth for companies, or sustainability for the type of companies that I support, or any other institution, whether it's a public or private entity. So probably, I mean, my question here was that there is a difference between collaborators, people you ask their opinion, and deliberators, meaning people that you have trained or that you have given or empowered to really take decisions. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the collaborators should be external, and the deliberators should be internal. Probably Google found a way, like Amazon, to have also deliberators outside their sphere of comfort or their current or conventional spheres of power.
Giulia, short reaction.
I think the distinction is a good one. Collaboration is not the same as deliberation, and for those of you who are Italian, they might have an example of a national party that maybe mix the two a little bit, talking about direct democracy and then not really delivering on that idea of that deliberation is not just clicking. I think that the broader point, though, is it goes back to that idea of trust and saying what's the relationship between the industry and the users, especially with regards to data. I mean, we all know the idea that if you don't pay, then you're the product, etc., etc. Well, that's probably one of the fundamental differences that the tech sector, as it developed, has introduced, and that hasn't yet been governed. Or that the public sector hasn't yet found a way to govern. So the tech companies were free to develop that relationship in a way that that wasn't the case for traditional companies. And now there needs a governance, and I think that's what especially the European Union is grappling with at the moment.
Yeah. Richard, you have the last sentence. Has to be short because people are desperate for jumping and running and feeling free. So
in that case, I should probably abstain. No, this is again, when I shared one of the slides, I said, you know, we need to be really careful in choosing terms clearly. And again, this idea of involvement, engagement, cooperation, deliberation, consultation, that's all really very, very important to understand. And I think it's absolutely true. We've started to understand that there are enormous differences between asking somebody for their opinion and taking direct action on that opinion versus including that in a broader base of data that we can turn into knowledge that then drives intelligence, and making decisions based on that instead. So I think, no, I would agree with what's been said. And again, I think it comes down to clarity of terminology.
I'd like to thank you both. The whole discussion went completely different than I prepared. I want to discuss with Giulia the whole system developed by Hewlett Packard in the early 90s for voice recognition. I wanted to discuss with Richard the unbelievable possibilities of 5G and edge computing. And I became in the middle of a more or less political and a philosophical discussion about governance and about democracy. And I think it was excellent. So I'd like to thank you both for this very interesting discussion. And I like to thank the audience because you were very active. And I want to offer you 50 minutes of freedom. So I hope to see you back. And thank you again.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Well, Giulia and Richard and Gianluca, if you have the time to come back after a cup of coffee, it would be great to continue this discussion, because I think that what we heard earlier from Gianluca about, you know, how governments are adopting and using the latest bit of technology, AI, but it could apply to any other technologies, and the consideration